Welcome to Cheap Controls. We make videos on things that we struggled with, hoping to help you so you don't. Consider subscribing and hitting that bell.
In this video, I'm going to go over the HTML and the CSS for this tester project that I'm building. I'm not sure how much interest this video is going to have right off the bat. I'm making it more for a reference video. So during the more fun part of it where we're reading some sensors and displaying them, you might come back to this video. I'm going to do the best I can to timestamp it in the description, so that way you can come back and find the parts that you want to find. But if you don't know much about HTML and CSS, this will give you a brief overview on it. I'm not going to cover this in detail. I'm just going to make it work. If there is a true HTML CSS person out there, they're probably going to be slightly offended by this video, but I'll go over the basics of it and we'll see where it goes. I use Visual Studio for all of my coding, at least for the Arduino, but for all the other coding. And I found it to be pretty effective, and that's what I'm going to use for this. I have no files built up so far, except for I have a directory, and it's on my desktop. But I don't have the index yet. The only thing I have is I have an image, and that's the Cheap Controls logo, and it'll go at the top. And then I have some blank files in here for the body and the head of the styling. So the first thing we'll do is we'll just create a new file. And the main file in your directory, usually name it as index, and then that way you just refer to the directory and it just pops up on the browser. And then I use this function called emit, and it helps you do code quickly. And if you have a blank file and you put an exclamation point and hit enter, it auto-populates with the basic setup for a web file. And in this case, I'm not going to go over all this, and to be honest with you, I don't even know what half of it means, so you can look at this later if you want. But the big thing is this title, and the title appears at the top of the page. So I'm going to change this to CC Test. And now you can see that this is just on the desktop. It's just a folder called Tester. And now I have this index.html in here. And when I double click on it, it'll open up in a browser. And at this point, it's blank, but we'll refer to this as we build it out. But you can see up here it says CC Tester. Now, when I build something for the web, I usually just do a crude hand drawing first, just to get an idea of what I want to do. And for this one, the way I drew it is I want to put my logo at the top and make this area up here the head. And I'll have a little menu in there. And then I'm going to have this main area down here where I'll have a start button, I'll display pass-fail. And then over here will be my diagnostics box where I'll show some signaling, like is Python running, am I actually pulling data, things like that. And then I need a little area to display the data. And then down here I have a footer. I'm going to break it up into the header, the main area, and then the footer. And you don't get confused because this head up here you don't actually see on it other than the title. But you don't see this anywhere in the code. And in here in the body, that's where you see everything. And this is where I've added my sections, the header, the main area, and then the footer. The first object I'm going to add is the logo, because that, of course, is the most important thing, the Cheap Controls logo, of course. And you have to have the image itself, and I put it in a folder, images/logo, and that's why it's up here. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add my navigation. And you notice I have these IDs. If you use an ID, it's how you can find something in the page later when we go to style it. But you can only use it once. So if I use ID equals header nav, I can't use ID equals header nav anywhere else for another object on the page. I'm going to use an unordered list, or UL here. It can also be an ordered list, and that'll put numbers in front of it. But in our case, we're just not going to have anything in front of the list itself. And then here's the list items. And initially, I had 4 pages. So I have my main tester page, then I have a changeover page, a limit page, and a diagnostics page. But I've already changed it a little bit because I don't know that I'm going to have the limits page. But this is the way I have it right now, so this is the way I'm doing it. And now if I show you the page, it should have the logo on it and this list. So if I do a refresh, you can see that I've got the logo, and then I've got the list. It's not very pretty, but I have the stuff on there. And that's what I usually do. I try and get all the stuff on the page first. Now the main, I'm going to have it divided up into 3 areas too, like that hand drawing I did. I'm going to have a diagnostics area. I'm going to have the test functionality, which will be a button and a message, and then the test form itself, which will have the data. I'm calling it a form. These are standard terms that you'll see in HTML, a div and a form. But you could make this anything. Like I can make this CC if I wanted. As long as I have a closing bracket to go with it. We can just leave it like that and it'll work just fine. Now in the diagnostics portion, I want to have a title for diagnostics. And then I've got 2 things that I want to watch. So I want to watch if the Python is active, and you can see I have this P tag. It stands for paragraph, even though it's not a paragraph. It's just nice for text. And then I want to keep track of the test running. So when the test is running, I want to have a little indicator, and when Python is active, I want a little indicator. I use these span things in here too, and they actually denote nothing. So when I put a span in there, I gave it an ID, but to start with, there won't be anything on the page. You won't know that it's there. And then I have this text area in case I want to put an actual message out there, some text. And I've set it up for 4 rows and 50 columns. And you can see it appears over. Well, let me move this up. And you can see the diagnostics, the 2 active things, and then the messages will go there. The test functionality, or the test function area, which I've called CC, I have that set up. I'll have an input for a button to start the test, and then I'm going to have another little message window that's going to be more for the tester, the person operating it. It'll say press start to begin, and then it'll have a pass or fail, and it'll be a little bit bigger. And you can see it appears under the messages. If you notice, everything is coming in the order that I'm adding it. Because on the HTML, it flows down the list. It reads it a line at a time. Now this test form, I added everything all at once. This could be another list, an unordered list, and then a list item. And then each item is going to be a row. It's going to appear as a column right now. And you'll see this where it says name, value, lower, and upper. You'll see that over on the screen here in a minute. But I'm going to want those to read across the screen instead eventually. Then under that, I'm going to have DC volts, ohms 1, AC volts, and ohms 2 will appear. I don't know if that's what I'm actually going to do when we get to that point, but that's what I'm going to populate with it now. And then each one of these has 4 columns also. It'll be ohms 1, it'll be a value, and then it'll show the upper limit and lower limit as we load the page. So now you can see we've got the diagnostics, Python active, test running, and our messages. But then down here you can see how name, value, lower, and upper. Well, I want it to go name, value, lower, and upper, and then I want DC volts 100 and then a space for the limits, and then ohms 200 and a space for limits. We'll be adjusting this in the CSS. There's only one area left, and it's this footer. And really the footer is going to be identical to the header as far as the navigation. So if you look at the navigation up here, this is identical to this. The only difference is I have footer nav here for the ID under the nav tag, and up there I had header nav. So then I can style them just a little bit different, but all the LIs will be the same. And now you can see that it's test, and there's a little more space between these links. And these links would take us to other pages that we haven't built yet, so it would just crash. But if you go up here, it's test, and there's the other pages. If I click on change over, we just get file can't be accessed because it doesn't exist yet. Now when we get into the styling, the header and the footer down here are going to be the same on every single page. But the body, or the test portion of it in here, could change depending on the page we're on. So I've split the CSS into 2 files so we can access each one individually. And I've got the two files, body CSS and head foot CSS. Now, if I decide to have a separate CSS for each page, I'll probably change the body to the page name. So it'd be like test and then changeover.css. And then that's how I would differentiate them. But for now, we'll leave it like this. I'm going to open them both. And now they're up here, and then I'll close this. This way we can see this part and this part about at the same time. I'm going to start with the head and foot one. Now I always start with this at the beginning. It shows the colors that I'm going to use on the site. It doesn't mean anything, and this portion is ignored because this first word up here refers to something on the web page itself, and I have nothing called color information over here on the web page. So for me, it's just something so I know the colors and these hex codes for them. And if you I use this background dash color, which is a legitimate CSS, but it still won't make any changes because it's referring back to this color information object. So it brings up this as a nice way to see the colors. So you'll notice that I'll add this at the top of the body CSS also. And since the head and foot.css is going to be on every page, I do some things that will apply to every page. And in this case, this asterisk means it will apply to everything. It's like a wild card. And I'm going to set all my margins and padding and sizes, and there's certain behaviors that I just want to change across the board. And if I save this and I refresh this, you'll notice that this changes. Except for in this case, it didn't. And that's because we have nothing to tie the CSS over here to the index page. And that's where you have to go back over to this head up here. And I like to add them right above this title right here. And so what I've done is I've provided a link, and it's a style sheet, and it's to this href, or this location, and it's css/body.css and headfoot.css. And if you look here, I put them in this directory, this CSS directory, and that's why I have to refer to it in this way. But now when we refresh the page, you should notice a big change because I've set all my margins and padding to 0. Oh, and also on the UL, list style is none because I don't want there to be these little dots over here. And now you can see it's all smashed together. Remember when we had a space between test and changeover? It's just, now we'll have to create the spacing that we want between everything. Well, the first thing we'll do is we'll mess with the header and the logo itself. And so I've identified the header, and because I've used the word header, it goes back to this index file and it finds the word header. And it's going to apply to the area that contains all of this stuff. And we're going to give it a background color. We're going to align the text a certain way. We're going to give it a width 100%, which means the whole length. I'm not going to go over all of this. This is something that I'll have the code on the Cheap Controls website as soon as I get the blog post done. And you can download it and you can make changes to all this stuff and play around and see what you can see. So now when I do a refresh, you'll see now that everything's centered. It's got a nice little background. It looks pretty good, except for now this down here doesn't look great because I want these to line up across instead. So now I'm going to refer to the unordered lists in the nav. So this will affect the footer and the header because in the index, I have this nav tag. And I'm not referring to the ID, header nav, I'm just referring to the nav tag. And down in the footer, I also have a nav tag. So all of the UL in both of these will be affected by this. But in the header, I'm only going to affect the LI, or the list items within the header itself. I'm going to give them a border. And you'll see how I'm going to radius the top, left, and right, and then I'm going to do some fun things with it. So now when I reset this, you can see that they go across like this. And if I go down to the bottom, now these go across. They're still kind of ugly though. So now let's adjust this P tag over here and then these anchor tags over here. So we're going to set these nav A's. These are anchor tags A, and what it does is it makes it change to this blue color or some other color once they've been clicked on. And if they haven't been clicked on, they're one color, but we're just going to get rid of that. And we're going to change the color of the text. Same thing in the P, we're going to change the color of the text. So that means the page we're on is going to be red, and the pages that are available to us are going to be blue. And then we're going to set the width to 300 pixels. But since we set this UL to be flex, it'll do some adjusting for us. I would definitely look at this flex and do a little reading up on it. It makes life pretty easy. And then for the footer, we're going to change it and make it a little bit smaller text. And there, now that looks pretty nice. So we have the header navigation and the footer navigation. And they're fairly identical, except for the header has this border around it. And if you'll notice, there's no border at the bottom. And that's because I put this up here. I changed the color so it blends in. And you can see I've got an error here, and that's because it's in red. And that's because I put one of my little notes. So I'm going to delete that. And now we're all cleared up. Now we'll move over to the body CSS. Once again, I'm going to start that empty. I'm going to add my colors to the top. That way I just scroll to the top and I know my colors. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the background color of the body. I'm not going to make it white. I'm going to make it kind of a grayish color. And then I'm going to set the styling of the main. I'm going to set the width to be 80%. So there'll be a border on each side. And when I mean a border, I mean spacing. And then I am going to put a border around it with radiused edges, so the curves on the edges. And I'm going to add a little padding to it. And the body in relationship to the main over on the index is the body is all of it, including the header. And then the main is this portion that contains all of the stuff that's between the header and the footer. So now you can see that it's starting to look a little bit nicer. Now I like to put notes in my code. And since each page could have its own CSS, and maybe I'll put it all in one file, maybe I won't put it all in one file, I make a big note to note that I'm now going to be working on the test page. Everything above this is kind of going to be the same on any page, but this is going to be specific. And then I also add a little note here for the diagnostics, that's the section I'm going to be working on. And you can see I've done quite a bit of styling with it. I've set the width, the height, I've set some padding and relative, the position and such. But the big thing is this float. So I'm going to float this box, which is going to be whatever, pretty much the size of whatever's inside it. I'm going to float it over to the right. And when you float it, that means that stuff can kind of wrap around it, and they'll try to ignore the box itself. You'll see when I update it here. See how it jumped over here? But it's the first item in the list. If I didn't do the float, all of this stuff would be below this box. And if you hit F12, it brings up these tools. And we'll go to the main. And we're going to go to this diagnostics. And then I'm going to scroll down to the float. I'm going to turn it off. Now we'll make this a little bit bigger. And you can see how it changed it. And it made it go the whole place. It did some auto stuff, so it kind of calculated some things on its own. But if I click this float, then it puts it over here. And I like that look a little bit better. And then all this stuff will kind of wrap around it. And then remember how I said the span was nothing? Well, you can take that nothing and then you can define it to be shapes and such. And so the first one we did in the diagnostic span which is the first spans you see, we're going to set them up as flex. So that means everything within them is going to be across in a row, which is nice because that's the way it defaults. I did add it in here, flex direction row, but you really didn't need that because that's the way they default. And then I'm justifying the content in the center. So whatever I put in there is going to be centered. But what's nice about flex is it'll put stuff in certain spots automatically, which is nice. And then we've got the P, which is this text, this Python active and test running. They're within those. And we're going to define, we're not actually going to define the size of those yet. We're just defining the height. And then we've added some padding to it. The way that padding and margin works is you'll see there's 4 characters, and it's like a clock. It starts at 12 o'clock, then it goes to the right side, or 3 o'clock. So we're going to add 10 pixels to the right side. And then the next 0 is at the bottom of the clock, and then the final 0 would be at like 9 o'clock on the left side. So we've added a little padding to one side. And then the Python indicator and test indicator, those are more spans. And what we've done is we've given them a width and a height of 15 pixels. I've given them a border and a background color. But if you'll notice, I set the radius at 50%, and that'll make them look like a little circle. And then for the diag message, I really didn't need this. I put display as block, and that just forces it to go down at the bottom. Or it forces a new line, so that way if some weird thing happened with spacing, it wouldn't be up next to these spans. And now you can see that these have popped into place, these little circles. So then we can change the color of those circles based upon whether Python's running in the background or not. And that's where it gets to be a little more fun. I'm going to click over here on this, which allows us to select things. And you can see that this gives us our width. And the width of this is 95.55 pixels. And what we're going to do is we're going to set this bottom one and this top one to be the same width. And so this way, let me click out of that. This way, and we're going to align the text to the right. So they'll line up even, and then hopefully these dots will line up on top of each other. And we do this over here on this P, because this is where our text is. We're going to set the width to be 110 pixels. And we're going to have the text aligned to the right. So now when I refresh it, it should line up a little bit nicer. And so that looks a little bit better. And you can see that it's moved over, and then it's got the same space. So now if I click on this, you can see that there's space over here on to the left of the T because it moved the text over the right, and we've got our padding, and then the same thing over here. And then we have the test function itself, and it's just these two things. We got the input box and then this div with the message itself, and we have another one of those spans. And you'll notice that I use the spans quite a little bit because they're easy to find, and you can designate it by the ID test function. And then you can go to the span. And remember, we changed these to CC, and you'll notice that everything looks fine. In the end, I'll go back and change these to divs, but for right now, we'll just leave them CC. So we're going to affect this button, and we're going to affect the div, the span, and the text within there. So the first thing we'll do is we'll add a little padding to the whole thing, and then the input itself we're going to display as inline block. If we didn't do that, it would stack things on top of it. Like you see over here, how the start's above this press start, I want them to be next to each other. And by changing it to inline block, they'll put them next to each other. And then the span, we're going to do quite a bit to that. We're going to display it as flex, so everything in there will line up. We're going to line everything to the center. We're going to set some margins, and I'll show you that too, because that's kind of interesting the way I do that. The width is 300, so then I'm going to move it negative half that. I'm going to set the height to 75, so you'll notice it'll get kind of big. And then the background color is going to be this color here. And then the border is going to be that blue again. I have to make this a little wider so you can see it a little bit better and how it lines up. But you can see when I click on this now, I set this box right here to be to have a padding of 50% on each left and right. And what it did is it moved it over here to this middle right here. But then when I shifted it negative 150, then it moved it over here because it references off this edge, this left edge right here. And so if I wanted it centered, I move it over halfway and then I move it back half the distance of whatever you've created. As long as that's a static size, you can do that. And I knew it was 300 pixels wide. I can move it back 150. The only other thing I want to do is I want to make that text in there a little bit bigger. And when you do a font size, I use the EMs because 1 is the size of all the text on the page. So 2 EM is just going to double it. And you can see it's a little bit bigger. Makes it easier to see. So this will say press start, or when the test is done, hopefully it'll go to a green and say passed and a red and say failed. So now we're going to move on to this form area. I put numeric results, but you could put anything in here, just so you know what it is you're talking about. And what I've done is I'm going to set the font size to 1.5 EM. So it's not going to be as big as the one in the button, but it's going to be bigger. And then for all my LIs, I'm going to put some padding to the bottom of them, because this is the top, the right, and then the bottom, and then the left. You can see it made it a little bit bigger, and it put some space below each one of the line items. Now, these are things within the line item, this name, value, lower, and upper, so it didn't do anything space-wise. It did it at the end of the LI, not the items within. Now, for each LI within there, I've got a label, and then I've got 3 P tags. And you can see up here, it's a label and 3 P tags. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to affect the label, and then we'll do the P tag second. So for the label, I'm going to show inline block, and then this will stop the things from stacking on top of each other, but it's just going to affect that first one. And I'm going to text align everything to the right, and I'm going to give it a width of 300, so a nice wide width. And then I'm going to add a little padding to that itself, to the label itself. And so you can see it moved it over, because now it's 300 pixels wide, and it text aligned it to the left, or to the right, and then we have a little bit of padding there. Now for the P tags, we're going to do the same thing. They won't be quite as wide. They're not going to be 300 pixels wide, but they're going to have 10 pixels of padding to the right. We're going to change the background color on these, though, and we're going to give the text the blue color. Now for the ones that we have the dot here, where it says dot limit, that's a class instead of an ID. Now you can see that each LI has 4 items, and the second and third P tag in each item have classes of lower and upper and then limit. And the space in there makes them to have 2 classes. And so that way I can reference these by limit, by that dot limit, or dot upper and dot lower. And this, or I can access them by the ID. But since I want to affect all of the second and third P tags on each one of these, I'll just call it by limit. And so I'm referencing it by the ID test list, which is this up here, this UL, and the limit. So I'll make all those a lighter color than I'm making the other P tag. You'll notice I'm referencing the paragraph tags with both of these, but I'm just getting more specific with this one down here. Now you can see everything is looking a little bit better. So the logo looks pretty good there. I've got a nice menu at the top. I've got a start test button. I've got a message. I could use a little bit of space between these two things, but the diagnostics looks pretty good. We're pretty close to what we need this to be. But I think what I'm going to do is put a little bit of a buffer between this whole area up here and this area down here. And you can accomplish this in one of 2 ways. We can either take this area up here, my test functionality, and add padding below, or we can take this form data and add padding above. We'll do the padding above first. So if I take this form, I'm going to add padding to the form itself. And I want to add, let's say, 25 pixels to the top, and then we'll keep everything else 0. And now we've got a little pad here. We can also do it by going to the bottom of this one, of the test functionality. And since the test function already has, well, that's weird, I put 20 pixels in there. And that is the bottom because it's top, right, bottom, and left. Maybe I have something mistyped. Let's make this like 50. And we'll see if we get any sort of change. And we don't. So I might have a typo. And this is where it's important because with HTML, it has to be the text has to be perfectly put in there. And we're referring to the test function ID. So let's go back to index. We can close the form and we'll open the test function. Oh, maybe it did matter. Maybe I finally found an excuse not to use CC or a reason. So let's change this to div. What I'm wondering is maybe it didn't treat it correctly because I didn't have the proper HTML code. Oh, and then there we go. So I'm going to change this back to CC. I'm going to change this to CC. And see if it was because it's treating it, I have to specify the type of display it is. Like I said before, there's probably somebody watching this that's an expert in this. That's just banging their head against the wall going, you idiot, this is what you're supposed to do. But let's go back to this. Because what you can do is you can do it display block. And there you go. What it was doing was it was taking that CC and it wasn't treating it as if it was a block item. It was showing it differently. So that's kind of interesting. That didn't come up when I was doing a run through and just messing around. I guess it's because I didn't change it to CC, but I wanted to show you that in the video. So you can get around it. You can name these things kind of whatever you want. I am going to stick mainly to the conventional ways of naming things just because it's easy. But there are whole new things now. Some people use something called sections, and they use there's lots of different things you can use to divide up your code that will make sense. And as you learn it and play with it, you will. But for this tester thing, that's not really what we're into this for. We want to show data on the screen. We want to access Python. We want to access the MySQL. And that's really what we're going to get into. And when we do it, these IDs, especially in the form down here, because this is where we're going to put the stuff. So like if I want to set this DC volts, this will be the label DC volts. And then when I get the value back from the database, I'm going to write it to this ID part number, and I'll be able to adjust that 100 and change that value. But we'll be doing it based upon the ID. And that's why it's important to know that those IDs have to be only one on a web page itself. You could copy it on different pages, but within the page itself, you want it to stay the same. You can use classes for styling. A lot of people will tell you only use classes for styling and give every component on your page a class. Well, I've never really found that to be useful. I like to keep mine as clean as possible. Next week, I'm going to get into a little bit of the JavaScript and how we auto-load some things and then how we tie the JavaScript to the MySQL. I think you'll find that a lot more interesting. And then the week after that, I'll get into the Python and tie that back into the MySQL. And that's how we'll determine how the web page will know if Python's running, because they're going to toggle a bit in the MySQL database on and off. I'd like to cover that in one video, but I think it's just going to get too long.
Well, that's about it for this video. If you like what you saw, consider giving me a thumbs up, and also consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching.